Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 3, Aristotle. Now, introduction about the unit. Unlike Plato, Aristotle was not an Athenian by birth. He was born in Stagiria, was a pupil of Plato, and subsequently taught Alexander, and then established his own school, the Lyceum. Aristotle's relationship to Plato was similar to J.S. Mill's relationship to Bentham, as both Aristotle and Mill repudiated major portions of the teachings of their masters, Plato and Bentham, respectively. This fundamental difference between Plato and Aristotle led him to initiate two great streams of thought, which constitute what is known as the Western political theory. From Plato comes political idealism, and from Aristotle comes the political realism. On this basis, it is very easy to understand the comment by the Coleridge, the poet, that everyone is born either a Platonist or an Aristotelian. The difference between Plato and Aristotle is the difference between philosophy and science. Plato was the father of the political philosophy, and Aristotle the father of political science. The former is a philosopher, the latter is a scientist. Former follows the deductive methodology, the latter an inductive one. Plato portrays an unrealizable utopia, the ideal state, where Aristotle's concern was with the best possible state. Professor Maxey rightly says, all who believe in new worlds for old are the disciples of Plato. All those who believe in old worlds made new by the tedious and toilsome use of science are disciples of Aristotle. Aristotle, like Plato, wrote voluminously. We know Aristotle has written on many subjects. His admirer claimed for him the title of the master of them that know. For about 1,000 years, according to Maxey, Aristotle on logic, Aristotle on mechanics, Aristotle on physics, Aristotle on psychology, Aristotle on astronomy, Aristotle on economics, and Aristotle on politics was almost the last word. The impeachment authority than which none was more authentic. His information was so much vaster and more exhaustive than insight, so much more penetrating. His deductions so much more plausible than true of any of his contemporaries or any of his successors prior to the advent of modern science, that he became the all-knowing master in whom the scholastic mind could find no fault. Whatever subject he treated it well. Whatever work he wrote, he made it a masterpiece. His legacy, like that of his teacher Plato, was so rich that all those who claim themselves as realists, scientists, pragmatists, and utilitarian look to him as teacher, guide, and philosopher. Referring to Aristotle's contribution to social science, Abraham Adam says, Aristotle's distinctive contribution to social science are a methodology of inquiry that focuses on man's rationality yet stresses the continuity of man and nature rather than a basic cleavage. The integration of the ethical and social as contrasted with the dominant modern proposals of a value-free social science and an autonomous ethics and a systematic foundation for morals, politics, and social theory, and some basic concepts for economics, laws, and education. We are using introducing Aristotle, and we will introduce him as the man and his time, his works, and his methodologies. The first one is the man and his times. Aristotle 384 to 322 BC was born at Stagira, then a small Greek colony close to the borders of the Macedonia kingdom. His father Nicodemus was a physician at the court of the Amyntas too. A longer part of his boyhood was spent at Pila, the royal seat of Macedonia. Because of his descent from the medical family, it can well be imagined that Aristotle must have read medicine and must have developed his interest in physical sciences, particularly biology. Upon the death of his parents, Aristotle's care fell upon a relative Paroxenus, whose son Nicanor Aristotle later adopted. Although not an Athenian, Aristotle lived in Athens for more than half of his life. First, as a student at Plato's academy for nearly 20 years, and later as a master of his own institution, Lyceum, for about 12 years or so, between 335 and 323 BC. He died a year later, Salacious, the birthplace of his mother Phalanx, while in exile, following fears of being executed by the Athenians for his pro-Macedonian sympathies. I was not allowed the Athenian to commit another sin, he had said during the intervening period of 12 years. He remained away from Athens. His journeyman period between 347 to 344 BC, he stayed as Assus and one Herminas, a, a tyrant and an ex-slave, but a friend of the Macedonian king Philip's. He married Hermas' niece and adopted daughter, Phylas, and on his death later he began a union without marriage with Hyperius, a Stegrata like Aristotle, and they had a son named Nicomaches after Aristotle's father. Aristotle's relationship Hermas got Aristotle close to the Macedonian king, whose son Alexander and later Alexander the Great was Aristotle's student for some time, much before the establishment of the Lyceum in 335 BC. Like his teacher, Plato, Aristotle had kept his association with men of the ruling classes, with Hermas, between 347 to 344 BC, with Alexander between 342 and 323 BC, and with Antipater after Alexander's death in 323 BC. Such an association with rulers helped Aristotle's penetrating eye to see the public affairs governed more closely. From Hermas, he came to value the nature of one-man rule, learn something of economics and the importance of foreign relations and of foreign policy. Some reference to these are found in his Politics. From Alexander, Aristotle got all possible help that could impress upon the collections. Alexander is said to have utilized the services of about 800 talents in Aristotle's service and induced all hunters, fowlers, and fishermen to report to Aristotle any matter of scientific interest. From Antipater came Aristotle's advocacy of modern polity and of propertied middle class, something that Aristotle had advocated in Politics. From Lycurgus, the Athenian statements, and a Platonist and Aristotle's classmate, Aristotle learned the significance of reforms, which he made a part of his best practicable state. But that was not all that was Aristotle's Aristotle. Indeed, had his own too, his family background of looking at everything scientifically. Plato's impact over a period of 20 years, his keen observation of political events, his study of 158 constitutions of his time, and his elaborate studies at the Lyceum through lectures and discussions, all these combined to make him an encyclopedia mind and prolific writer. Now, his works. Aristotle is said to have written about 150 philosophical treatises. About the 30 that survive touch on an enormous range of philosophical problems from biology and physics to morals to aesthetics to politics. Many, however, are thought to be lecture notes instead of complete polished treatises, and a few may not be his but of members of the school. There is a record that Aristotle wrote 6 treatises on various phases of logic, 26 on different subjects in the field of natural science, 4 on ethics and morals, 3 on art and poetry, 1 each on metaphysics, economics, history, and politics, and 4 or more on miscellaneous subjects. Aristotle's work can be classified under 3 headings: dialogues and other works of a popular character, collections of facts and material from scientific treatment, systematic works. Among his writings of a popular nature, the only one which we possess is the interesting tract on the polity of the Athenians. The work on the second group include 200 titles, most in fragments. The systematic treatises of the third group are marked by a plainness of style. Until Werner Jaeger, it was assumed that Aristotle's writing presented a systematic account of his views. Jagger argues for an early, middle, and late period where the early period followed Plato's theory of forms and soul. Middle rejects Plato, and the late period, including most of his writing, is more empirical oriented. It is not certain as to when a particular work was written by Aristotle. W. D. Ross presumes that Aristotle's writings appeared in the order of his progressive withdrawal from Plato's influence. The dialogues, especially in Rhetoric, on the soul, the prospectuses on philosophy, were written during Aristotle's stay in academy. Dialogues like Alexander and On Monarchy were written during the time or later when Alexander assumed power. To the period between 347 and 335 BC belong to Aristotle's the Organon, the Physics, the Dello, a part of De Anima, and the Metaphysics, the Endymion Ethics, and a greater part of the Politics. All these are largely Platonic in character, but in the form of dialogues. To the period of his headship of the Lyceum belong to the rest of the works, notably the Meteorological, the works on psychology and biology, the constitutions, the Nicomachean Ethics after his son, Nicomachean from Hyperliph, the Poetic, and the Politics. Aristotle's political theory is found mainly in the Politics, although there are references of his political thought in the Nicomachean Ethics. His constitutions analyzes the system of government on the basis of his study of about 158 constitutions. Notable among them is the Constitution of Athens. Aristotle's Politics, like any other work of his, has come down to us in the form of lecture notes and consists of several essays written at various times about which the scholars have no anonymity. Jaggers argues that there is a distinction to be made between the original politics, which is Platonic in inspiration and which deals with the construction of ideal state or the best possible, and the truly Aristotelian politics, which contain a much more empirical grasp of how politics works to the real political world. Barker puts the order of 8 books of the Politics on the basis of internal development of Aristotle's idea. The first 3 books deal with the beginning of primarily principles and criticism. The fourth and fifth books, traditionally arranged as the seventh and eighth book, deal with the construction of the ideal or the best possible state. The later 3 books, sixth to eighth, traditionally fourth to sixth, deal with the analysis of the actual states and also with the causes and cures of revolutions. The next point is his methodology. Aristotle's methodology was different from Plato. While Plato adopted the philosophical method in his approach to politics, Aristotle followed the scientific and analytical methodology. Plato's style is almost poetic, whereas that of Aristotle prose-like. Scientific as Aristotle's method of study is, It is at the same time historical, comparative, inductive, and observational. Barker comments that Aristotle's methodology is scientific. His work is systematic, his writings are analytical. Aristotle's each essay begins with the words observations shows. It is said that Aristotle had employed over 1,000 people for reporting to him anything of scientific nature. He did not accept anything except which he found was proven empirically and scientifically. Unlike his teacher Plato, who proceeded from the general to the particular, he followed the path from a particular to the general. Plato argued with conclusions that were preconceived, while Aristotle, in a scientific way, arrived at his conclusions by the force of his logic and analysis. Empiricism was Aristotle's merit. Aristotle's chief contribution to political science is to bring the subject matter of politics within the scope of the methods which he was already using to investigate other aspects of nature. Aristotle, the biologist, looked at the developments in the political life in much the same way that he looks at the development life of other natural phenomena. Abraham Adel identified features of scientific methodology in Aristotle. Some such features are: his conception of systematic knowledge is rationalistic. According to him, basic concepts and relations in each field are grasped directly on outcomes of an inductive process. Data are finished by accumulated observation, common opinion, and traditional generalization. Theoretical principles emerge from analytic shifting of alternative explanations. The world is a plurality of what we would today call homostatic systems, whose ground plan may be discovered and rationally formulated. Matter and form are relatively analytic concepts. Dynamically, matter is centered as potentiality and form and culminating actuality. Man is distinctively rational. Major characteristic features of Aristotle's methodology can be briefly explained as under. The first is inductive and deductive. Plato's method of investigation is more deductive than inductive, where Aristotle's methodology is inductive than deductive. The deductive features of Aristotle's methodology are quite visible, though shades of Plato's reasoning remain in the margins. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics does contain ideas of normative thinking and ethical life. Same is true about his politics as well. Like Plato, Aristotle does conceive a good life, his deductive thinking, but he builds good and honorable life on the inductive approach about the state as a union of families and villages which came into existence for satisfying the material needs of man. His inductive style compels him to classify states as he observes them, but he never loses sight of the best state that he imagined. The next is historical and comparative. Aristotle claimed to be the father of historical and comparative methods of studying political phenomena. Considering history as a key to all the secrets, Aristotle takes recourse in the past to understand the present. The fact is that all his studies are based on his historical analysis, the nature of the causes and description of revolution, which Aristotle takes up in the Politics, have been built historically. Aristotle also follows the comparative method of study, both intensively and extensively. His classification of state together with the consequent cycle of change is based on his intensive study of 158 constitutions of his time. Through comparative analysis, he speaks about the pure and perverted forms of states. The next is teleological and analogical. Aristotle pursued teleological and analogical methods of analyzing and investigating political phenomena. His approach was teleological, using the model of craftsmanship. Aristotle instated that nature works like an artist, and in the process, it seeks to attain the object for which it exists. Nature, Aristotle used to say, did nothing without a purpose. Man lives in society to attain his development. State helps man to achieve his end. Following his teacher Plato, Aristotle found much in common between a ruler and an artist, between a statesman and a physician. The next one is analytical and observational. Aristotle's methodology was both analytical as well as observational. In his whole thought process, he observed more than he thought. All his studies were based on data and facts, which came under his keen observation. Through study, experiments, and observation, Aristotle analyzed things and therefore reached conclusions. Regarding state as something of a whole, for example, Aristotle went on to explain its constituents, family, and villages. He declares man a social animal by nature, considers family as the extension of man's nature, village as the extension of family's nature, and state as the extension of village's nature. Here we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.